Well, thank you, Greg, and thanks everybody for having me this evening. It's a great pleasure. I've been asked to speak on something in the realms of preparing for persecution, which sounds very ominous. To that end, I thought actually the best thing I could probably do to start with is to set some basic parameters, so to describe the paradigm that we're in so that we understand where we're at biblically. And the first things first, I think there's biblical principles for government that we can understand. I'm in the world of government, dealing with policymakers. And then there's a biblical description of what goes wrong for governments, and therefore what goes wrong for the people of God under those governments and how we should respond. That's basically how I'm going to talk for the next 20, 25 minutes or so. But understanding the government, we've got a couple of key passages, and the principal one would be Romans 13. And you know, we get some really significant principles there. We learn firstly that governing authority is instituted by God, and it is described there as that which God has appointed. Now, it doesn't talk about particular kinds of governments, democracies, monarchies, etc. It doesn't talk about particular institutions of government, but it talks about governing authority as a thing, a kind of authority that is instituted by God. It's actually God's thing. And so straight away we realize that governing authority is part of the system that God has ordained for this world. I had a guy come up to me once after a conference and say, "I'm a Christian anarchist." And I said, "Well, I hate to tell you, but you can't be a Christian anarchist because Scripture tells you that the governing authorities are ordained of God. And so therefore you need to believe in them and you need to submit to them," it actually says. So that's the first thing. But secondly, we need to understand that governing authority is entrusted to certain people in different societies throughout history. Jesus actually said to Pilate, he said, "You would have no authority at all unless it were given to you from above." This authority is vested in governors and kings and emperors and so forth, as Peter says in 1 Peter 2. And it's authority that carries with it a particular obligation. In fact, Romans 13 actually describes the person with governing authority as a minister and a servant. I think those are very significant words. You know, a servant is somebody that serves under the authority of another person. They're under authority. A minister is somebody who is rightly representing in ministry the interests of another person. And so the person with governing authority is a servant of God, serves under God, and is a minister of God, is called to represent the interests of God in the world. You say, well, hang on, what interest then? If they're this minister, they're this servant, the authority is God's, it's given to them, they have an obligation as a minister, and actually the purpose to which they are called to implement that authority, time and again, Scripture tells us it is this simple: to punish evil and reward good. That's what it says in Romans 13. In 1 Peter 2, it says, as sent governors, as sent by God to punish evil and reward good. It's a ministry of righteousness at its core. That's sort of the principle from which it can never depart if it is to do God's business in this world. Do you know, when I was a kid, I did a weird thing. I had a lot of weird proclivities. One of them was that I memorized all the biographies of the kings in the Old Testament, and particularly focusing on the biographies of Saul through Zedekiah. And you know, it's interesting. There's a lot of kings in that span, and they have all kinds of weird and diverse reigns. And there's a lot of things that go on. Some of them are 55 years long, like Manasseh, or I think 52 years for Uzziah. And there's political complexity. And there's all sorts of things that they do. And there's legacies that they leave. And yet for some reason, there is only one sentence that is ultimately used to summarize the reign of every single one of those kings. And the sentence always said, and I used to jump to the end and read the sentence before I read the biography. It always said, he did what was right in the sight of God, or he did what was evil in the sight of God. Isn't that amazing? In all the complexity of the king's reign, there's a simple core governing mandate that God gave him. Solomon was in the business of government, and he was a wise man, and he said, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And you know, I had a wise friend when I was younger, a mentor type figure, and he told me once, he said, do you know, the best way to understand something is never really to throw yourself into it straight away and try and learn as much as you can about it. He said the best way to really understand something is to grasp the organizing principle that lies behind it. And actually, this is the organizing principle that lies behind government. It's very simple. The authority is God's. It's given on trust to some in a ministry for what? To restrain evil in the world and to promote good in the world. And you think, I'm from Canberra. You think it's a whole city built on government. Think of the teeming thousands of public servants. You think of all the different courts and tribunals and different administrative bodies and quasi-administrative bodies and the Senate and the House of Reps and then the upper and lower house in all of the other parliaments around the country, except in Queensland where there's just one because it's awesome. And there's the committees and there's the inquiries and there's all the different things that go on in the business of government. It's like a monstrous beast that travels under that umbrella. And yet it's got such a simple core mandate: punish evil and reward good. Once we grasp that, and if every public servant and every person in government grasped that, what a thing that would be. It's actually government's ordained to be a restraint on evil in the world. And you actually think, it doesn't matter how bad a government is, to some extent they usually actually achieve that. Because so long as there's government, you can't do whatever you want. So long as there is something, and there's the rarest of examples in history where some government has been worse than no government at all, because anarchy means that you let loose all of the passions and the desires of individuals within the community, and we know, as good theologians in the room, that that's never going to look pretty. But government can go wrong, and there's a particular manner in which it can go catastrophically and irreparably wrong. And really, it does that when it loses that thing which is fundamental to its core responsibility under God. And that thing actually is a moral compass. If it loses the capacity to discern what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, then it simply can't even begin to do even the most basic feature of its role. And the situation is almost comprehended in Scripture. If you go to Isaiah 5 and 20, one of the woes there that's pronounced by God through Isaiah to the people, he says, "Woe to you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to you who have this moral inversion, who have reversed the moral compass and say that what is good is actually wrong and what is wrong is actually good." And my fear, as I've done this role since February the 3rd, and I've worked at ACL since 2014, both in the policy side with politicians and in the legal side as a lawyer with the Human Rights Law Alliance, the legal clinic that we established, my fear is that one of the key changes in Australia over the last 10 years is that we are on the train that's departed the station where God's version of good and evil is upheld, and we're moving to the Isaiah 5:20 side of the tracks. We're not there, but we're on the way. And I say that only after a great deal of evidence and a great deal of water under the bridge. And I'll tell you a few things that I've seen. In May 2016, I was involved with a couple of other lawyers in starting the legal clinic at ACL, which is a religious freedom legal clinic. And we said, look, we're going to help people who get in trouble with the law for living out their faith. But we've got to be happy for this to fail, because we're just guessing here that this might be a need. It might not be a need. That'd be wonderful. We don't want these cases to come in the door. And yet, since May 2016 till today, we've had nearly 50 cases where people have gotten in trouble with the law for simply living out their faith. Many of you will have heard, for example, of Patricia Wirrakun. Patricia spoke at this conference, I think, last year, was it? Or something like that? Well, what people don't know about Patricia, because she doesn't talk about it very much, is that she actually rang us one evening because she had been stalked for a couple of months by a guy who had seen one of her talks on the internet about gender and sexuality. She's going and unpicking the confusion on this stuff, particularly in schools. And ultimately, he assaulted her in her local shops. And she had to get police help, and she rang us, but that wasn't the only problem. Actually, what he'd also done is he'd reported her to the university where she has an affiliated status, and he reported her to a professional body with which she has an accreditation. And she lost that accreditation because she had Christian content in the talks that she was giving. And the university, we had some pretty serious legal help go with her. A former Federal Circuit Court judge, in fact, went with her to her mediation. And after significant negotiation, she got to keep the affiliated status, but she was essentially told, don't do it again. And that's the cost of doing what she does, using her gifts and talents in that area for ministry. Now, that's very normal. We have a councillor in Victoria who lost her accreditation because she participated in the No campaign. We've got a doctor in Queensland right now who's being hauled up to the medical board because of his Twitter account, because he retweeted my predecessor, Iles Shelton, who had a selfie with a guy called Ryan Anderson saying, you know, one of the good guys pushing back on gender theory in our schools, and he retweeted Miranda Devine, an article she wrote about gender theory. 2 tweets, reported to the medical board have accepted the complaint, and now asking him to tell them how that his Twitter account contributes to the individual health and well-being of his patients. I was in Perth this morning, and I told the people there of 2 local cases in Perth that are quite recent. One of those cases involves a couple, a Christian couple from Southern River area. And they applied to become foster parents. And they went through every stage of that process with the agency really well. I've read the documentation, and they passed with flying colours. They had a wonderful reputation with these people. They did brilliantly. And then when they thought the process was over, they were actually called back into the agency for one more workshop. And the one more workshop was a SOGI workshop, S-O-G-I, sexual orientation, gender identity. And they literally had to declare all of their beliefs around gender identities and sexual orientations and what it all means and what their view of homosexual conduct is and this kind of stuff, interrogated. Now, they had applied to foster kids under the age of 6. And so they kept saying, well, I don't see the relevance, but okay. They filled it out as a conservative Christian couple could fill it out. I thought it was a good balance of compassion and conviction. But of course, they got a decision notice a couple of days later from that agency saying it would not be safe for us to place children in your care. And so the government agency said, you can't have kids in your home. Now, I don't know how many degrees of separation there are between saying you can't foster kids because it's not safe and you can't have kids because it's not safe. Some of you might have seen the story that we have out there of Joshua Lawless. Interesting surname, but he wasn't lawless, he did the right thing. Joshua was a young guy, 21 years old. He's at the University of South Australia, and for 2 crimes, these are the 2 crimes he commits. The first one is that he's studying one evening with a friend of his. And this is in light of a church service a couple Sundays before that, where the pastor had told them all about being salt and light, wherever they are in the world, university or whatever. And he thought, well, gosh, I could do better at this. And so he came up with something. He thought, I know what I'll do. To make my Christian faith better known on campus, I'll pray for people when I find out they're struggling. And so that's what he decided to do. And so he went into university and he was studying with this girl because they were doing some group work together. And she was telling him that she was really struggling with anxiety and some mental health issues. And so he said, well, I'm a Christian. He thought, great, opportunity. I'm a Christian and I'd be happy to pray for you because I care. And she said, yeah, whatever, no worries. And he prayed for her. And then at the end she said, look, mate, I'm an atheist and I don't believe in God, but I appreciate the fact that you care. And he thought, great, job done. A couple of days later, he walked into a lecture theatre and this same girl was in there and she had a couple of friends with her. One of the friends called out, said, Josh, come over here. He walks over and they said, what would you do if you had a gay friend? So they'd obviously been talking about him. And he answered really well. He said, well, I'd be their friend, surely. I'd love them, I'd be kind to them. Maybe what you guys mean is that I wouldn't necessarily agree with what they do. And he said, but we could have a conversation about that because they'd be my friend. What do you reckon? And sort of one looked up and one looked down and it got awkward and he left the group. And he got an email from the university 2 days later saying, you've been reported for student misconduct. You need to come in and talk to us. And he went in to talk to them, not knowing what on earth this could be. And actually the report was just on the basis of the prayer by this girl. And the university found that he had created an unsafe learning environment for students by questioning their beliefs. And he was suspended and he had discipline put on his academic record. And he was told that he'd be enrolled in fortnightly counselling sessions to learn how to interact with his peers. And that if he came back on campus during the period of his suspension, security would remove him because of the safety risk that he was to other students for questioning their beliefs. Now, I got that call and I was like, that did not happen. That's rubbish. Because it was actually the first call we ever got. But we looked into it and I believe anything now. We have had so many crazy cases. In fact, we're at the High Court of Australia this year. This clinic, by the way, became a law firm at the end of last year. We're at the High Court of Australia, which not many cases get to, because we're representing a lady called Kathy Clubb. Kathy Clubb's from Melbourne, and Kathy's a sidewalk counsellor. She has been standing on a footpath near an abortion clinic in East Melbourne for years, and what she does, she calls her and a few friends call themselves the helpers, and they make simple offers of help as people walk past to go towards that building. She might hand a piece of paper that says help's available, or she might simply say, we're here to help if you need it. She's been doing that for some time. Sidewalk counsellors have a terrible reputation. In fact, there was a debate here in New South Wales recently about all the terrible things they're apparently responsible for. I assure you, it's a lot of claptrap. It's not true. There's a lot of good done by those people, and there's a lot of them, well, all of them are harmless, and in fact, if they weren't, existing police powers are more than sufficient to handle any actual obstruction or harassment that may take place. But see, Fiona Patten of the Upper House of Victoria is a member of the Sex Party, so she has certain ideological goals, and she knew full well that the exclusion zones legislation she was going to introduce would only stop Kathy. She knew that, and she did it anyway. But see, as a result of what Kathy's been doing over a course of years, she's seen more than 300 babies born alive as a result of her direct interventions. And she has helped every one of those mothers in whatever their need was at the time, because she knows that if they're going to that place, there's usually a need, whether it's safe haven from domestic violence, whether it's financial support or someone to come and help them in the house with the baby, or a friend. A lot of them are just all alone. Kathy herself's a mother of 13, so she's got quite a bit of experience, as you can imagine. And she's been doing that amazing work. The exclusion zones legislation passed. She went back to the clinic, as she always has, and a couple were approaching, and she went to hand them a piece of paper, which they declined. And you know there's a crime wave in Victoria at the moment, but the police resources are really well used, because 8 police officers arrested Kathy for handing that piece of paper over. She was criminally charged and convicted. She was given a $10,000 fine and a 2-year good behaviour bond. And now she's on appeal to the High Court of Australia, and every Attorney General in the country is against her for the crime of making a simple offer of help. She's charged with communicating on the subject of abortion in a way that can be seen or heard within 150 metres of one of these clinics. We have a Presbyterian pastor, Campbell Markham, at the Supreme Court of Tasmania at the moment, and the reason for that is for the crime of publishing a blog on marriage during the debate a little while ago, and because a guy in his church was handing out literature in the mall in Hobart, and somebody said, well, I'm offended, lodged a complaint to the Equal Opportunity Commission, and through some challenges to that complaint, he finds himself now at the Supreme Court of Tasmania. Now, those are legal challenges. This is the legal system of the land that I'm talking about on the whole here. These are governing authorities. But see, there's some really serious policy stuff coming down the pipeline as well. And you know, since same-sex marriage, those who are pushing that agenda very strongly, those at the top of sort of the activist echelons on the LGBTI side of the fence, they have moved on to the next thing. And the next thing is the T in the LGBTIQ. They're moving on to the whole gender-bending stuff. And people in Victoria right now know more than anybody of how serious it's getting down there, with the activist groups and the ideology coming into schools. We get calls at ACL all the time from mothers who are seriously distressed about what's going on. We had a call from a lady the other day who said that these activists came into the school with a government sort of funded program, and they talked all about gender and sexuality. They talked all about how you feel in your head is your sexuality, and how you look in your body is your sex, and how you feel in your brain is your gender identity, and so on and so on. And surprisingly, kids are getting quite confused. And one of the mums rang and said, look, they came into my daughter's girls' school, and 2 weeks later there's 15 lesbian couples in year 10. Why? Well, it's not a best friend anymore, is it? Because all of a sudden you could be a lesbian. That sort of thing's really widespread. The other thing is there used to be 1 or 2 presentations at gender clinics in Victoria a year, and now there's thousands of kids with gender dysphoria, because they're exploring things, thinking about things that they shouldn't be exploring and thinking about, and they're being confused. Surprise, surprise. I mean, I used to do youth ministry up in Brisbane for 6 years with kids in really difficult circumstances. Drug abuse parents, refugee migrants and so on, all sorts. And I just think to myself, it hadn't got a foothold then when I was doing that. With all the problems those kids had in their life and all the things they had to overcome, I just can't even imagine if they had this to deal with as well. But the most serious manifestation of this, and I'm not making this up, you can look it up for yourself, page 193 of the current Australian Labor Party's national policy platform, and we're not party partisan, but I've got to call it where it comes out, of the current national policy platform, which is the policy platform that will be implemented as law if they win government. It says in that platform, it's got a section called LGBT conversion therapies, but you need to ignore the heading because it'll just confuse you. You need to look at the text. The text says that Labor accepts that claims that a person's gender identity or sexual orientation can change are false, harmful, and should not continue to be made. So it starts at the level of speech. So gender identity, how they feel about their gender in their head, how they feel about their sexuality in their minds. Claims that can change are false and harmful and should not continue to be made. Now that's a problem for every church, every pastor, I hope, because all of us change in Christ. I'm a heterosexual man. My desires change in Christ. It's called sanctification. It may take time, but it happens. There's many people that I talk to who have come from homosexual orientation and they now live a heterosexual life or a celibate life or whatever. Claims like that are to be stopped under the language of that policy. It goes on to specifically mention religious communities where such claims can be made to prey on the vulnerabilities of anti-LGBTI forces. And then it finishes the section by saying where these harms are suffered in the context of the home, Labor will deem it to be domestic violence and psychological abuse against the child. That's very serious. You can imagine a kid goes to a safe school in Victoria where they've now got a doctors in schools policy on the way. And so they have doctors in the schools that can, and they've got the frameworks in place for if a parent's not gender affirming, the doctor can contemplate whether or not to tell the parent about the social transition of the kid, all this stuff. If a parent intervenes, the risk becomes, particularly if a church is involved, the risk becomes conversion, illegal, psychological abuse, domestic abuse. I have talked to the senator who wrote that policy. And she was very clear to me that's exactly what she means. Because I'm sitting there thinking I'd like to be charitable and hope that I've misread it. And in fact, when we put that campaign out to our base, a lot of people came back and said, you've jumped the gun, this is rubbish. Because it's to the point where there's a big believability problem. But it's true, and I talked to her and she was clear. She said, well, she thought I was crazy. And I thought she was crazy, so we didn't get very far. But that's exactly what she means. And I just want to finish quickly by saying this. Being that as it may, and bet that I've beaten you down a little bit into the doldrums, the question comes, what on earth do we do? What do we do as the church? I just want to sketch out a few principles from the words of Jesus himself. There's a little song we used to sing at Sunday school when I was a kid. Listen to the words of Jesus, spoken clear and plain. Here they are. In Matthew 5, he actually says, blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And I think increasingly we need to understand that promise. And it's a promise of blessing. It's not psych yourself up to blessedness. He says you are blessed. We need to understand this. He says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. He says you've got a greater hope than whatever's going on in the world, and don't forget it. It's important that we reach that point. We want to avoid all of this, but it may just be in God's purposes that we don't quite get to avoid it, that we have to go through it. And there's a promise there over and over in the Bible that there's joy in trial, and we have to start to prepare ourselves to believe that and know that it's true. It's interesting, all these clients that I talked to you about, every one of them says it was a good thing. It's quite confronting. Josh, the 21-year-old, says he was just skating through life and he wasn't serious about his faith. And this has been a good thing for him. There's actually growth to come through this, and there's a special blessing. I used to think Paul and Silas were nuts when they sang in jail. I don't think they were. There's something of God that comes on a person in these circumstances that equips them to deal with it when it is for righteousness' sake. And a lot of people turn around to me at this point and say, Martin, you're crazy. This isn't persecution. No one's being fed to the lions. No one's dead. Yeah, that's true. And I don't want to, cast doubt on any of that stuff. But Jesus actually says in his very next breath, He defines his persecution. He says, "Blessed are you when others revile you and speak all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." Evil speaking, false speaking, bigot, homophobe, unsafe workplace, unsafe learning environment, unsafe home. These are all evil, these are false allegations. Or revile, the angry disgust. I actually did an interview with Margaret Court in Perth yesterday, and there's a woman who spoke, and there was angry disgust from wall to wall in the media, and that's the environment into which we move. And the 30% that are still standing, as Rory was saying, a lot of people sitting down are pretty disgusted with you that are standing, and that's why we're standing a little bit tentatively. Jesus actually does mean this. But and I also want to realize this, people often then turn around and say, but Martin, the only reason people don't like you is because you're not winsome enough. You need to be kinder, you need to be nuanced, and so nuanced that people will love you. And I go, oh, look, yes, there's an obligation to be wise, more than ever. But he says, so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, Isaiah wasn't sawn in half in a hollow log because he wasn't winsome enough. It happened to him because of righteousness' sake. Jesus says that actually those who stand for truth can expect to encounter this kind of opposition. You can't winsome your way out of it unless you mean win some, lose some, because you certainly will lose some. And then we say, well, what do we do? And I'm literally just going through the lines of Jesus in Matthew 5. And the very next breath, he actually is actually a call to boldness and integrity. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And the warning is, don't lose the flavor. And he says, you are the light of the world. And the warning is, don't hide the light. Now that's the temptation. When the pressure comes on, even a little bit, we just crab walk backwards just a touch. And that's the threat. He says, do good works to shine the light, not in the church, not to your family, but like a city on a hill that cannot but be seen by everyone, to the world. Boldness, and I wish I could get this message out to the whole church, is that we're entering a time where absolute boldness is called for. When the disciples were hauled into the old anti-discrimination tribunal, the Sanhedrin, and they said, stop speaking. They didn't leave that place and say, well, how can we restructure our ministry so that we can get around the regulations? Or how can we go underground? Or how can we, be more winsome and nuanced with the message? No, they had the words of Jesus ringing in their ears, go and make disciples of all nations. And they knew that there was a conflict. And they said, Lord, look on their threats and grant your servants boldness to continue to speak. They didn't back down. And we mustn't. We need to be wise, but we mustn't back down, because that is so often the temptation that comes to us and that stands in front of us. And finally, I want to say this. Realize the first thing that we want to give up on is good works and truth-telling in public. But it's really important that we realize that Jesus actually says here that we need to continue to do good works in public through shining the light. I think there's a problem in the church whereby we're either gospel only, raw evangelism only, or charity only, good works in public only. Jesus wants us to continue doing the lot, I think. And the mistake we make is saying, look, when we go out there and try and do good and try and speak up on these things in various forms, the problem is we get hostility. And we don't want to have to deal with the hostility when we go in to speak in the public square to governments. But we're happy to deal with the hostility on this issue, say the raw evangelism. Or we're happy, we pick and choose. But the fact of the matter is we can't pick and choose. We need to continue to do the whole lot. We need to continue to evangelize people, and we need to continue to be a strong witness for good works in the world as well. And we don't need to jettison any of those things. And the problem we face is the assumption that because there's a negative blowback, that it's not good. But see, didn't Jesus teach us anything? He did a lot of good, and there was a lot of negative blowback. Actually, the promise that Jesus makes as he closes is he says, continue to do your good works, whatever they are, whether they're the fruits of the gospel, the doing good in the world, or the gospel itself, the proclamation of it, anything in that spectrum. He says, when you do good works, people will see them and they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. And that's actually that's a promise. It's a guarantee. And because, sometimes the loudness of persecution is hostile. But sometimes, even in the loudness of persecution and the hostility, there's the quietness of God's work that goes forward. And that's usually the way it works. And sometimes in those moments, we've just got to believe that God is working. We've just got to believe that God is advancing his kingdom, because afterwards it becomes clear. And I see this all the time at ACL. Our office has been car bombed. We've had all sorts of things happen. But that's the loud bit. That's the persecuting bit. That's the reviling bit. But we need to always remember the promise of Jesus that if we are bold and if we don't lose our flavor, if we remain Christian to our bootstraps, and if we don't lose the light to go and forth and evangelize and do good in the world, if we don't lose those things, his kingdom actually will advance quietly. And I don't have time, but if I did, I'd tell you endless stories that are wonderful of that nature. And for now, I think as we move into this time, we need to say, actually, the promise of Christ is, in boldness, there's great joy and blessing and blessedness, and there's also opportunity for the work of God to continue to go forward. Thank you.